Today we'll be speaking with Dr. Greg Siegle on emotion elicitation. Dr. Siegle received his PhD degrees from the San Diego State University and University of California, San Diego joint doctoral program in clinical psychology. He also completed a clinical internship at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health in Toronto and an NIH postdoctoral fellowship in clinical cognitive neuroscience at the Western Psychiatric Institute and Clinic. He's currently an associate professor of psychiatry at the University of Pittsburgh School of Medicine, where he directs the program in cognitive affective neuroscience. Dr. Siegle's research program examines brain mechanisms of depression, anxiety, and recovery from these conditions, as well as using tools of neuroscience to predict responses to treatments and guide novel treatment development. Dr. Siegle has authored over 90 publications and 13 book chapters and has received several honors, including the Western Psychiatric Institute and Clinic Young Investigator Award and the Junior Faculty Scholar Award. So I now turn to a special Experts in Emotion interview with Dr. Greg Siegle. Today I'm especially excited to be speaking with Dr. Greg Siegle from the University of Pittsburgh School of Medicine on emotion elicitation. So Greg, what I thought we could start out with is asking a little bit about where the journey all began for you. Sort of when and how did you first get interested in emotion?
So back in the dark ages, I was doing computer modeling of human judgment. And we were incorporating all of the rational factors we could imagine putting in. Naive knowledge of physics and how people make analogies and all. And it just wasn't capturing some basic decisions that people were making. And there was a guy at Northwestern, Clark Elliott, who was modeling emotion. And Clark said, so why don't you just incorporate emotion? People use it all the time. And all of a sudden, the whole world opened up. We incorporated an emotion into our basic human judgment modeling, and we're able to talk about phenomena we'd never been able to talk about before. But something else happened, which was that people actually became interested in the work. That is to say, there were immediate clinical implications. There were immediate implications for how people act in their daily lives that they were actually interested in. And I realized that if I wanted to make an impact on the world, that was where we had to go.
That's exciting. So since then, the world has opened up and you've become really a pioneer in this field of emotion, not only sort of basic tools to elicit and study emotion, but also translating it, in terms of having implications for clinical disorders. And so I want to ask you a bit about your work in this realm. What I'd like to start with is, first just acknowledging that you're one of the few people out there that really has this beautiful, complex grasp on like a whole host of really cool and complex, methodological tools for eliciting and studying emotion. And so as an expert in this area, I wonder if you could just say a little bit about what you think are some of the most effective tools for studying emotion.
Sure. That's a great question. And I think it depends on what you're trying to do. If what you want to do is activate brain areas that are involved in emotion, in some sense, this is very easy. We can use very low-level stimuli, like emotional faces, which activate areas like the amygdala that process emotion, or even just the whites of people's eyes. But these things don't generate subjective emotion necessarily. If your goal is to create subjective emotion, to make people feel something in a way they can detect, what we found is there are a few routes that are useful to go. One is personalize the stimuli. Anything relevant to you and your life seems to work better in our hands than things that are emotional in general. So we've gotten great mileage out of getting scripts from people about the best or the worst times in their lives, playing music for them that they think is sad or is really happy. The other route we've gone is, and this is much more recent, is looking at very low-level stimuli that people can't ignore and is emotional. Things like pain or sexual stimuli that really just grab people almost unaware and seem to generate strong emotional responses.
So what do you see as some of the current limitations in the existing tools we have for eliciting emotion?
I think there are a few limitations. One huge one is that the different measures of emotion that we have don't agree often enough. So you would hope that the same stimuli that people say that makes me feel something also makes their heart rate change reliably, and also makes their brain change reliably. And we haven't yet got to the place where we have the gold standard stimuli that makes all of this stuff happen. So we're learning that emotion is really differentiated. I'm not sure whether this is a problem actually in our stimuli and our tools or our basic understanding of emotion. Similarly, June, as you well know, and you've helped to pioneer, some of the things that we hope are very positive are actually very positive, but they're also kind of negative too. So things like graduation and family are some of the most emotional stimuli we have. And some days these are very positive, and some days they're very negative. Getting tools that elicit exactly the emotion we want when we want it are really hard. We have some amusing film clips that a lot of people say, yeah, that didn't strike me as very funny. And some very sad film clips that people say, yeah, not working for me. So we're still in the dark ages, I think, of trying to elicit the kinds of emotion we want on command.
So then what are some of, in your perspective, some of the critical next steps that we need to do as a field to really try to elicit these, personally salient but also potent emotions that are, part of what color our everyday lives?
Right. So I think that we have to be willing to step out of the boxes that we as psychologists and neuroscientists have made for ourselves. That is to say, the stuff of science is repeatability, so we like normed stimuli that we can present for exactly a third of a second, that look exactly the same for all people, and this is very easy to analyze. As we've discussed, the more we get out of that box, the more strongly we can generate subjective emotions. If somebody says, yeah, this thing is very negative for me, that often will work for them. It's uncontrolled. Some people bring in pictures of their dog, and other people will want to play sounds of their new baby. Figuring out how to integrate across these very personally relevant pieces of information in a way that lets us still do rigorous science is going to be a challenge for us.
And as you think about challenges, your work has also taken on some really challenging directions where you've been using some of these complex, but fascinating both psychophysiological and neuroimaging tools to try to elicit sort of individual variation in emotion processing in ways that can help us understand some of the most severe and chronic emotional disorders, such as, unipolar depression, which you've done a lot of work on. And I wonder if you might say just a little bit about your work here in terms of what do you see as the most exciting discoveries when we sort of chart into the clinical realm using tools of emotion elicitation?
Well, I think to put this work in context, when we started, we thought that, well, depressed people respond strongly to all negative things. And it was a great starting point. And we've continued to nuance this. The field has really continued to nuance this perspective in a couple of ways. The first is to say that perhaps depressed people don't do anything fast. It might be about this negative emotion unfolding over time. So yeah, that's a little bit negative, and it reminds me of something else that's negative, which reminds me of my life, which is very terrible and makes me more sad, and I think about more sad things. And so you can present a stimulus, but then 5, 10, 15, or 20 seconds later, the emotions really start to kick in. And perhaps minutes or hours later, people are still ruminating on what got elicited for them. So having a very strong understanding of the timing of how depressed people's mood unfolds is so important. Think about the person whose mood drops. You say something positive, like puppies. They think, oh yeah, well, puppies are very cute, but they pee on my carpet. And well, that means my house will smell and I'll die alone. All of a sudden, this person is spinning on negative thoughts, but that's 15, 20, 30 seconds later. So that's one thing we've learned about depression. Another thing we've learned about depression is that there are brain systems that are important to consider. So you have the low-level areas of the brain, like the amygdala, that say, yeah, that's bad, that's very bad. And they're probably looping in concert with some low-level areas that retrieve episodic memories. That's bad reminds me of something else that's bad, which makes me think about how bad things are. Healthy people, these areas would then shut off after a while. In depressed people, what we found is it's not about just that loop, but maybe it's about the brake system. Some of these areas that would shut off these loops either aren't functioning, the prefrontal regulatory areas just aren't coming on to shut off the amygdala and those systems, or perhaps it's the connectivity that's disturbed. So you put on the brakes, but the brake line is cut. So you're saying, yeah, I want to regulate now, and you're trying, and those regulatory areas turn on, but they're not talking to the areas that would actually have to be downregulated. So it's a little bit of a complex picture. The final thing we've been finding, which is very exciting, is that not all depressed people are exactly the same. So you think that all depressed people react strongly to negative information and they ruminate and they get very upset. That's true for some, but then there are the others who kind of shut down and become very blunted and retreat into themselves. And this is a group of people who really are quite understudied in the literature. If you look at the people who are chronically abused, have had histories of chronic trauma, these are people who've learned to exit stage left when something emotional happens. We know they're not in the room. We don't know where they went. And we really don't know what to do for them for treatments. So we're just starting to study these people as a really important and interesting group.
It's interesting. I mean, with these discoveries you're talking about, especially the latter one in terms of just the variation within depressed people, how do you think about the potential ways that this work could help us better understand issues of, differential diagnosis or even developing, targeted treatments that are honing in on these emotion-related processes in depression?
That's a great question. So let's take the two pieces of it separately. For differential diagnosis, what's happening at the National Institute of Mental Health is that they have suggested we really step back from the kinds of diagnoses we have today and think about basic emotion processes like negative affect or negative emotions and how people might be differentiated along that continuum. We're starting to look at that and say maybe there are different kinds of people who all present subjectively as depressed, but maybe once you get down to a biological level, they look quite different. And so we've actually got a large project that we're working on now to see if there are these separate groups of people who someday we might consider diagnosing differently. As to treatments, this is a statistical problem. Every other medical specialty, you walk into the clinic and say, Doc, I feel like I want to die or I'm going to die, and they do a test, and based on that test, they treat you. In psychiatry, psychology, somebody walks into the clinic, Doc, I want to die, and we treat you. There was no test because we don't even know what mechanisms to look for. So our perspective is before we even make targeted treatments, make targeted assessments that let us know what we're dealing with. And perhaps those can lead us to one or the other of some valid treatments. We know that some psychotherapies that we have, like cognitive behavior therapy, works for about half the people we give it to. Medications work for about half the people we give them to. We don't even know if these are the same people. And we're working now, if it turns out that if you let me scan your brain and just look at these systems, these emotion systems that react to negative information and those that regulate the negative information reactions, I can tell you whether somebody will get better in therapy, and actually how much better they'll get in therapy with a pre-treatment brain scan. So even before making new treatments, directing people to the treatments we have that are likely to respond to it is a huge area.
I mean, so this relates a bit to, you're talking on a really interesting thing that I've heard you discuss before, where you've proposed this really innovative way where we can integrate some of the laboratory tools we have, so neuroimaging, for example, and use that information to actually inform clinical assessment in order to determine what kinds of treatments are going to be best for different individuals. And I love this idea of this sort of, future translational clinic, that is incorporating neuroscience, potentially psychophysiology. And I just wonder if you could say a bit more about this vision of how we can have a clinic operate in the future and do a better job getting these kind of clinical assessment, pieces of information to help people.
Absolutely, absolutely. So my vision of the future, which actually is not just mine, but a number of people are converging on this idea, is one in which we do assess mechanism. We're going to have to do it cheaply, which means probably we can't throw out self-report, but we can ask self-reports that, A, we understand discriminate between who responds to what kind of treatment, and use that to guide us. And then, if we need to, move to some next level of assessment, like psychophysiology. And if that tells us what treatment somebody gets, great. If it doesn't, we could then move to something even more expensive like neuroimaging. So for example, there's a replicated predictor. If you say to me that you are chronically single, you have never had a relationship that lasted longer than 3 months, you're not divorced even, but you've really never had a long-term relationship, it turns out you're likely to not respond very well to cognitive behavior therapy. You might respond well to interpersonal therapy. That's a replicated predictor. Do we use it in the clinic? Not yet, but we could. It's a very small number of people who have that condition. The rest of them, maybe we need to do psychophysiology on. So that's step one. Step two, as you were alluding to before, is these targeted treatments. Once I do know what the mechanisms of your disorder are, or your condition, we might want to treat them directly in ways that don't necessarily involve a clinician who's beating around a very large bush, talking about your mother and all the emotional things that have ever happened in your life. If your problem, for example, is that you can't access or turn on these prefrontal regulatory systems we were talking about that help you decrease your level of emotional reactions, maybe we could help you to train yourself just to use these regions. Turns out these same regions are used for things like working memory, putting numbers in order. So maybe we could just have you practice serial addition or putting numbers in order for a couple of weeks. We found actually that this kind of thing works. You do that for 2 weeks and people's rumination goes down. So a combination of targeted assessments that help direct people to validated treatments and targeted treatments that actually address underlying mechanisms, I think will make for an inexpensive, publicly acceptable, and efficient clinic of the future.
So interesting, Greg. I mean, just thinking about everything we've talked about today, starting with, different powerful tools to elicit emotion that you're truly an expert in and someone I look to often for advice, how you've translated these tools to understand really important insights about processes relating to psychopathology and just how much variation there is within a given, quote, disorder category we use like depression, and then how to take these insights and really leverage them to inform clinical assessment and ultimately treatment. I mean, these are really all such interesting themes, and I think about, in many ways, this is where the future is headed. That being said, I want to ask you, in your own opinion, when you think about the future of the field, where do you see it headed? What are the sort of most important steps that lie ahead?
Again, June, another great question, and something I think would behoove us to think about regularly as we start to gear our research, not for the interesting questions of today, but for tomorrow. One of the things that may be very useful for us to pay attention to is this integration across multiple levels of response, the subjective, the physiological, the neuroimaging, because at the end of the day, we are an integrated whole person, and being able to assess the whole person and know how our assessments interact is what's going to let us combine them to say something that's clinically important. The National Institute of Mental Health's Research Domain Criterion Initiative that I spoke about before, where we're assessing about across levels, I think is going to be greatly helpful in that regard. A second direction is that the majority of research that has been done on emotion to date has looked exactly and only within one person's head. I am thinking negatively right now, and I am ruminating, and it may go on for me for quite a while. And yet emotions rarely happen in a vacuum. Looking at how people interact and how these interactions generate and maintain emotions dynamically, it's going to be a huge area. It's going to mean really having a strong handle on the time course of emotions as they unfold, and then not looking only at that time course within one person, but within two people. That's going to take new statistics, it's going to take new assessment methods, and it's going to take a whole new level of thinking. Once we get past two people, then there are also networks. And there's beautiful work that people are starting to do on entire networks of people interacting, not only face-to-face, but through media like social media. Brave new world. The final focus that I think is going to be important in the future is development. That is to say, I used to really hope that doing work on kids was something I could do by treating them like very small adults. And anybody who's a parent could probably have told me that that was not true. Kids are unique beings. Their emotion systems are just developing. And it turns out that people who have disorders as adults don't come from nowhere. These things often start out as children. Learning to integrate across the lifespan and learning what the progressions are from younger generations on up through adulthood is going to be something that's very important for the future research in emotions.
Thanks, Greg. And so the last question I want to ask you relates to the future research of emotion. And perhaps you can think of it as the kids of the future research, which are students right now. When they come to you and ask you for, your sage, Dr. Siegle advice, what kind of advice do you have for students, or would you give to those who are just thinking about embarking in this field?
I have two pieces of advice. The first is make your work meaning something. That is to say, there are a lot of really interesting questions in this area. Asking, so who will answering this question affect? Who is going to be helped by knowing the answers to these questions? Seems to be a guiding principle that helps a lot of people to do work that impacts the public. That said, we have a long way to go. Turns out there are no biomarkers in the emotion clinic yet. Nobody's using psychophysiology or imaging in the clinic. You're going to be the pioneers who bring it there. The second piece of advice is don't do your work alone. As we start to integrate across multiple levels, self-report, psychophysiology, and neuroimaging, and bring that together with clinical treatments and different kinds of populations, people get overwhelmed and say, yeah, I can't do this work by myself, it's too much. And I absolutely agree. I think team science is going to be the stuff of the future, and embracing it from very early on, even as a student, saying not how can I do this whole project, but who can I collaborate with, and who can I work with to make my ideas a reality, or to make our ideas a reality, is I think going to be the stuff of clinical science and emotion science in the future.
Well, thanks so much for speaking today, Greg. It was wonderful to hear your thoughts. They're always so inspiring, I think, for everyone that talks to you. So thanks.
Thank you, June.
So this concludes our Experts in Emotion interview with Dr. Greg Siegle from the University of Pittsburgh School of Medicine. Thanks again, Greg.
Thanks.